Economies of scale are one of the most important determinants of monopoly power or oligopolistic power, imperfect competition. And let's suppose a firm faces huge costs to make their product just to have it exist, but then very low cost to replicate one more copy. And let's think of spreadsheet software. And there used to be actually several different important spreadsheets. I guess now Google counts, but pretty much it's dominated by Microsoft Excel. And we can see that when we think about the cost structure of a market like the market for PC to hit the bottom, PC spreadsheet programs. Well, the costs of making a spreadsheet program are really, really high. I don't know how high, $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, some very high amount. But then the cost of making one more copy is very close to zero. I'm going to make it real small so it's above the quantity axis, but it might actually be the quantity axis if it's truly zero. So dollar per copy of the program. What this means is that firms in this industry will face average cost curves that are downward sloping, because remember, the average cost curve is the sum of average fixed costs and marginal costs. Well, marginal costs are very, very low, so the average costs look a lot like the fixed cost curves. Well, what the ramification is that bigger firms are going to have an advantage. So if we think of one firm with a small number of output, let's say Q naught, and that firm would need a price of P naught to stay in business. Well, if a firm could get large, producing, say, 3 times the output, Q1, that firm could break even at P1. The lesson here is that bigger firms can undercut the smaller firms, and the bigger firms will come to dominate the market. Now, if the demand is such that the demand is really close to the average cost curve of one single firm, this is what we call a natural monopoly, and we'd only have room for one firm in this market. But typically the demand might be further to the right, but not so far out that we could have room in the market for more than, say, 2, 3, 4 firms. So PC spreadsheet software, I suppose if we count Google, they offer for free a pretty low power spreadsheet. But in terms of high powered spreadsheet for commercial and home users, Microsoft Excel is almost the only game in town, and has been for decades. Back when things first started, Lotus was the dominant firm, and there were several other. Ashton Tate made one. Microsoft entered and blew both of those out of the water. There might have been one more I'm forgetting, but as the markets evolved, turns out there's room for just a single firm, at least according to the outcome, right? Microsoft's the only game in town. When we talk high-powered spreadsheets, low-powered spreadsheet, Google's a big player. And Apple makes some Apple Works file that's, I think it's okay. But it has a market share of like 0.5% at the most. All right, let's turns out the next couple of problems that teams missed were redundant to the ones I talked about in the last screencast, but let's have a quick look. All right, if the demand curve facing the monopolist is, I had turned that paper, let me erase that. If the demand curve facing the monopolist is P equals 70 minus 14Q, then the slope of its marginal revenue curve is, remember we talked about that in an earlier screencast, the marginal revenue function for a monopolist that faces a straight line demand curve is a line with the same y-intercept and twice as steep. So the marginal revenue function would be 70 minus 28Q. And graphically, that would look like this. Quantity, price, talking without thinking. Price dollars per unit, units per month. All right, this would have a y-intercept of 70 and an x-axis intercept of 5. And then the marginal revenue function would have that same y-intercept but be twice as steep. So it would cut the x-axis at 2.5. Label my demand curve. Anyway, that's the way these work. That you don't need to know how that's derived, but it is very handy when we work with Monopoly technical problems in this unit of the course. Ooh. All right, and then finally, I did talk about this last time. It turns out for a competitive firm, the marginal revenue was equal to the market price. So P equals MC was our output rule. But in the general rule that includes both competitive firms whose marginal revenue is just equal to the price and non-competitive firms that face a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, that means that their marginal revenue curve is somewhere below. For the competitive firm, it looks like that. The output rule, it's supposed to be marginal revenue. The output rule for the competitive firm is produce the profit maximizing quantity if you're going to operate, if you're not going to shut down, is produce where price is equal to marginal cost, which turns out to be the same as marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then for a monopolist, the output rule is if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, keep increasing output. Where do you stop? Right where marginal revenue, marginal cost are equal. That's this quantity. We'll call it Q naught again. But the price for that good is read off the demand curve. And so P naught would be way up there. But the output rule, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the profit maximizing output rule for any firms facing a flat line, perfectly elastic demand curve, and firms facing a downward sloping demand curve.